Reverend Father Sebastian, Reverend Father Jose PJ, Reverend Father Augustine George, Professor Aloysius, distinguished members of the faculty, and my dear students. A very good morning to all of you. It's my proud privilege to JMP College, especially to participate in this Vichar Manthan, which is being scheduled quite often. And I'm happy that some of the previous speakers included my beloved Guru, Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam. And in fact, that was another incentive for me to be here today. When Professor came and invited me, then he described the past dignitaries who have come here and talked.
Type of training what you get here, you will excel in your professions. As you know, India is a really great country with a rich heritage and past. Even before the civilization grew in other parts of the world, the prehistoric civilization which existed in the Indus Valley was an example of a high quality of living, which was answers which we had, and also the type of societies which existed and how orderly the system of the coexistence was there, even way back in the Rig Veda times. Of course, the written history was much later, and clear indication that the Indian civilization was quite superior. But unfortunately, due to some natural calamity or other, that old civilization got wiped out, and later again it started building up. Maybe up to something like 600 AD, we found that we had again caught up with a fairly well-established system of education, the knowledge sharing and so on. In fact, the other day, one of the scholars, he brought me a script written in something like 5th century. It clearly depicts the motion of the planets around the sun, and also the periodicity, how to calculate and how to forecast the eclipse, etc. very precisely. As you know, this knowledge was really brought out very precisely much later, nearly 1,000 years afterwards, when the Galileo had the telescope and started looking at the stars and so on. So what happened to those knowledge? Yes, it's again a sad story. Because of the infighting among the kingdoms and invasion from outside, this whole civilization was really kept under the hood, and nothing meaningful came out almost 2,000 years. It is since independence, India has really seen that a lot of changes are possible and a lot of innovations possible, and we can catch up with the global leaders as far as the technology is concerned. You know that in Europe, the Industrial Revolution, which has come in the 17th and 18th century, was responsible for all the advancement, one thing leading to the other. It's the scientific knowledge which was brought out by great scientists, starting from Darwin to Newton, Maxwell and so on. So all those principles were put to use, and they have developed instruments for observation. So naturally the power of observation went, and new hypotheses and new theories came into existence. So there is an explosion of knowledge and exponential growth of technology which was taking place, and which is truly responsible for the high standard of living which we have today. Yes, India was totally lost in this industrial revolution. We were only consumers, and other countries, especially the UK, was exploiting the total natural resources from our country. But after independence, you can see that the India has really sprung back. It is the visionary leadership of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, which nucleated a large number of education institutions, research institutions, and then industrial houses. The basic infrastructure which is required for development. All these have been nucleated in the 50s and early 60s. He was really a pioneer, a visionary, who has shown the path of development for India is concerned. These investment we are benefiting. You can see that today the youth who are really talented, they can show their merit not only in the country but abroad also. That is because of the proper training which they are getting from various institutions in the country. In this context, I think government of course is doing quite a lot in spreading the education, which is very much needed, right from the grassroots level in the villages all the way up to the research level and so on. But one single thing which I have noticed, I have traveled the length and breadth of Kerala and seen many of the missionaries who have taken up way back in the 14th century onwards the education as a tapasya, and many institutions which has come up. In Bangalore also, I had opportunity to visit some of the institutions which is run by the Christian missionary groups, and they are really world class. I must compliment the efforts which you are putting in spreading education. Well, now if we look at the investment what is made in the science and technology, we don't have to regret. The achievements what we have in the field of atomic energy, space, defense research, etc. And more than that, in the agricultural research, what we have gained is world class, and it more than justifies the investment what we have made in those areas. You know, in the 60s, we were in a position we had to import the food grains which is required for daily life. But a team of scientists under Professor Swaminathan has taken the initiative of bringing in the green revolution to the country. He shown to the people that how the productivity can be improved orders of magnitude by properly selecting the seeds and also the cultivation practices and adapting to the fertilizers and so on. With the result today, we are self-reliant in food grains. We are nearly 220 million plus food grains we are producing, and part of that surplus is able to export to the other countries as well. Same way, if you look at the initiative which is taken under Dr. Baba, we know that we have deciphered the mysteries of the atom. We know how to split the atom and produce the energy. And this energy can be utilized by and large for peaceful purposes in our atomic power plants. And many of the isotopes and other can be used for healthcare, agriculture, and so on. At the same time, as a country, we wanted to show that we are powerful. So we have demonstrated how an atomic device can be exploded and which has got a weapon capability. So that's really developed as a deterrent so that others will not really scratch unnecessarily on trivial issues. So that way India has emerged as a powerful nation as far as atomic energy is concerned. I know in the field of defense also there are many things are happening. You know the number of missiles which are really developed under the leadership of Dr. Kalam at those days. They have become operational, and today we can take the weapons to as far as nearly 3,000 kilometers without any problem. So almost any neighboring country which can pose trouble can be deterred with this type of missile system. Now coming back to the space where I have spent almost my entire career, all of you know that we have really come a long way. We were a late starter as far as the space technology is concerned. We were 20 years behind the other developed countries, and in fact it was a Herculean task to really stand up on our own legs. Because this space technology, which involves rockets and satellites, they have the potential for dual use. They can be used for military aspects as well. So none of the advanced nations are willing to part with this technology to us. So it became imperative on our side to develop such technologies on our own without any help. In fact, again looking back in the history, after the Chinese, the Indian continent saw the first rocket system. It is Tipu Sultan, almost 300 years back. He has made small rockets and used it as a weapon against the British forces in Srirangapatnam and other places. Of course, the entire technology was lost with the British defeating Tipu Sultan and taking away all the technicians from here to some other parts. I don't know whether they have benefited out of their knowledge which they got out of these technicians. But we were really not having any activity in the rocket development almost these 300 years, rather 250 years. And in early 60s, we started making our own rockets. Those rockets were tiny ones, maybe slightly larger than the Diwali rockets which you are saying today. These rockets can carry a 10 kilogram of instrument to an altitude of nearly 10 kilometers, and then it falls into the sea. They were really small rockets which was weighing hardly about 20 or 30 kilogram. From there we have come a long way. Today we have perhaps one of the largest rocket systems in the world, the Polar Satellite Launch Vehicle and the Geostationary Launch Vehicle. These are examples of huge rocket system which are capable of performing various missions. To give a magnitude of these rockets, it is almost about 3 meters in diameter. It's almost the size of a small room, and height is almost 11-story tall. So you can see it's a huge rocket carrying something like 200 or 300 tons of propellant compared to about 20 kilogram of propellant in those early rockets. And perhaps they have become, in fact, if you look at the solid booster which you're using in PSLV, today it happened to be the second largest solid booster in the world. Of course, we were third, but by coincidence of events, the US, which was having the largest solid booster in the space shuttle, they decommissioned the rocket. So with the result, after Europe, we are the second largest solid boosters which is having. Then we didn't concentrate only on the solid propellants. We have gone for what is called the liquid propellants, and then later, recently, the cryogenic propellant rockets, and they have become really world class. With the result, this PSLV can be used for any launch of satellite into low Earth orbit, weighing nearly 1,500 to 2,000 tons. And of course, many of our satellites are not that big. So quite often we carry our own satellites and some satellites for other countries as well. In fact, the classic example was in one launch we had almost a dozen satellites carried with the PSLV. The GSLV is almost double the capacity. In a low Earth orbit, it can take about 3.5 tons to 4 tons, and it is primarily used for launching the communication satellites into the geostationary orbit. So this rocket system has really become the workhorse, and we routinely launch satellites for. In fact, in the early phase when we didn't have the capability to launch the satellites, we were depending on Russia and America for carrying our European launch system to carry our spacecrafts into orbit. So roughly about 60 such missions we have carried out. Out of that, nearly half of them, about 32 of them, were done using our own rocket system. And soon we will emerge as a self-reliant nation as far as the satellite launches are concerned. Now, you might be wondering why spend so much of money to develop this rocket, the satellites, and so on. I will highlight one or two examples of the satellites application that will give you an idea of why we are working on this. First of all, you must have seen the DTH, that is a small dish sitting on your rooftop and capable of receiving hundreds of channels of television. This has come because of the geostationary satellites, which are having a high power and high bandwidth transponders working in Ku band. With that, we are able to beam the programs anywhere in the country. Previously, you know that one tower, if you put in the city, hardly about 10 or 15 kilometers around, you can receive the television program. But today, using the satellite system, every nook and corner of the country is enabled with the TV broadcasting and TV program. Not only that, many of the villages, they don't have the proper connectivity, either the fiber or the cable or the mobile towers. There are nearly 60,000 villages in the country we don't have connectivity of that kind. So such villages are reached out using the satellite communication. the transponder which is there in the satellite relays back the signal which is sent from any station to the other one. So that way any villager can get the connectivity through the satellites. Then comes Earth observation from the geostationary orbit. You know that in our country quite often the cloud bursts take place, the cyclones do hit our coastal region and so on. So this can be monitored from the geostationary orbit, take the cloud pictures and find the movements of the cloud, and from there forecast where such severe events are going to take place. In case of a cyclone, it's at least 24 hours before one can have such warning. And with that, the district authorities can evacuate the people to safer locations. In fact, in the 80s, when a severe cyclone hit the Andhra coast, nearly 10,000 lives were lost. Last few years, of course, almost every year, some cyclone or other hits our coast. We were able to give this forecast, and the toll is not even 100 in every of these events. So that's a kind of effectiveness of using the satellite for disaster warning. Then comes the Earth observation. We have the satellites in the IRS, the ResourceSat, the OceanSat, and so on. So these satellites are equipped with a very powerful camera which can look at the planet Earth, and with that we can identify the natural resources. Once we know the natural resources, of course, first and foremost is the agriculture, the forestry, the mineral deposit, water resource, and so on. This becomes a very valuable information for the planners. See, for example, if you want to identify the areas sowed with rice or wheat, or where the cultivation of sugarcane is taking place, that can be identified from such images. And multiple passes of the satellites will give you how the agriculture is progressing in these areas. In case there is some affected area due to pests or any other infection, they will reflect in these images, and advanced warning can be given for positive intervention and corrective action. More than that, one can make the forecast of the yield in these areas. Appropriately, the collection of the grain and distribution can be reworked by the district authority. Of course, water is a scarce commodity. Availability of water, how it can be distributed, etc., can be easily detected from the satellites. Again, there are many places, drought-prone areas, where it's impossible to get water. So, of course, we can go on drilling wells based on conventional water divining techniques and so on. But it was found that hardly 30% of such wells yield water ultimately. So that means a lot of money is lost in drilling wells which are dry. So using the satellite technology and also trying the local geological features, one can identify the areas where there is a high probability of striking water. This has been tried out in almost 17 states which are drought prone. And the results are really highly encouraging, I will say. The yield has gone from 30 to 40%. Compared to that, today we are able to get close to 90% yield. So just the sheer saving on the amount spent on unyielding well itself will more than pay for the satellite which is being used for such purposes. So this is trying to locate water in difficult places one thing. Second, of course, you know that floods do take place every year as an annual feature, and to identify the areas inundated, and also to some extent what kind of mitigation measures can be taken in advance. So all these are possible by the images which is coming from the satellites. Yet another application is to look at the coastal region, look at the ocean. From the color and the temperature on the ocean surface, one can forecast which areas are having the probability of fish assembling and the fish school are maximum. And this again helps the fishermen to improve their yield and also not to hunt around. They can straight away go to the place where the fish schools are available. So this kind of technologies are being put to use based on satellites. Again, the two revolutionary areas in which the satellite communications will be put to use is tele-education and telemedicine. As you know, the competent teachers, good teachers who can communicate with the children are becoming scarce day by day. By having the tele-education, an expert classroom from anywhere, maybe from here in this college itself, one can emanate it, and it can be beamed to hundreds of such institutions. Of course, if you want to have interactive type of classrooms, it can be limited only to about 100 or so. But otherwise, on the receive mode, you can have thousands of such classrooms benefiting out of expert teachers' lecture from one single point. So this scheme has become very popular. First of all, to the primary education, where the science subjects are difficult ones, science, mathematics and English. So those classes are being taken to the villages. Here the Chamaraj Nagar is one of the pilot schemes which we have implemented. Today the entire state of Haryana is wired up with the tele-education to the schools. And then in the higher side, the management education, there are people who would like to take the weekend classes, and the professors are not willing to travel to other places. So sitting here in Bangalore, they are able to give classes to the students in Chennai, Mumbai and other places. So this of course has become a commercial model. Then the continuing education for the medical practitioners is being through the satellite link and so on. So the spreading of education to remote areas has been carried out through the tele-education program, and we are happy that more than a few million students are benefiting out of this program every year. Then comes the tele-education. You know, again the metros are rich with the expert doctors and specialty hospitals and so on. But if a poor villager wants to come here, he has to travel sometimes even a couple of days, and again come and stay here in expensive places and spend money, wait for the doctor to see him and so on. So this is a very time-consuming and laborious process and not affordable for the poor villagers. So what we have done is the satellite connectivity is put to use. From a village itself, the patient data can be transmitted to the specialist doctor. The special doctor goes through the patient data and then makes use of this data and have his own diagnosis. Then afterwards he holds a teleconference with the patient. This is as good as the patient coming and sitting in front of the doctor. So that way the expert advice from a cardiologist or an oncologist is made available to far-flung places in the villages. In fact, you will be surprised to know that Devi Shetty's institution here in Bangalore is providing service to the northeast region like Siliguri, Bengal, Shillong and so on. So that's the kind of power of telemedicine. More than 300 hospitals are tied together with about 60 specialty hospitals today, and even mobile vans are prepared with the telemedicine equipment, so it can go from village to village and provide service and so on. So you can see that though the space technology looks very exotic, but its benefits are being made available to the common man. This is the uniqueness of Indian Space Program, and I'm happy that we have shown to the world that we can put to use such high technology to improve the quality of life of the people. It contributes to the national development through the planning. It develops the villages through giving proper education and health care, and above all giving proper advices for their agriculture and fisheries. So this kind of schemes are being utilized, and in fact Madras School of Economics had made a study some time back. They try to, of course it is not directly quantifiable in terms of money because we are not charging any of the services, but they try to put indirect value addition and also the income generated in various sectors, and they found that it is something like 1.5 times more than the money which is spent in the space program until about 2005. So this clearly shows that the space technology is, though outwardly looks a luxury, but it is a necessity for a developing country like India. Of course, we were not tied to the ground, and we were not looking only at the problems of the ground. All of you know that our quest, the human, always used to have the adventurous spirit. Unless Columbus ventured out of Europe and then traveled around the globe, we would not have found Americas and the current economies and so on. But similarly, our quest will go outside the universe and outside our Earth, planet Earth, and the nearby objects are Moon and Mars. Of course, always the question arises: are there rich resources available in these planets which can be put to potential use, or otherwise is there a chance of making these moon or the Mars habitable, so that in case some disaster happens on the Earth, whether humans can migrate to these places. These questions are very far-reaching ones. Maybe we don't have to have an answer today, but the years to come, this is going to be the thing. So the quest for the knowledge about the Mars and the moon is very much in front of the humanity, and we have taken a real lead in this program. While concentrating about 90-95% of our budget for the application program, we have set aside a small portion of our budget for planetary exploration. And of course, in the earlier satellites, we used to have some instruments which can look at the signatures from other planets and the galaxies and so on. But later, we have made use of a dedicated mission. The objective was to explore the moon, and that was Chandrayaan. In 2008, we launched the Chandrayaan, a spacecraft weighing hardly 1,500 kilogram, and it had a number of instruments, hyperspectral images, laser tracking devices, altimeters, and gas chromatometers, and so on. So all these instruments put together, it was a powerful tool for exploring the moon, and this mission has sent the satellites around the moon. But while going to the moon, it was again Dr. Kalam's idea. He was the president at the time when we were conceiving this project. He said, if you go to the moon, you should put your impact there. And what way you can do? It's only by putting a flag. But if you want to put a flag there, it's going to be a very, very expensive program. So, but we tried to have an innovative way. We made a capsule which is around 40 kilogram, which can be detached from the mother spacecraft and thrown on the surface of the moon. Virtually throwing, in the sense, by the time it hit the moon surface, it has got 1.6 kilometer per second velocity. It's by a very big impact, and the whole thing will shatter. But still, we made it in such a way that all the surfaces had the Indian flag etched into it. At least one piece or other will survive, and it will be there. Of course, it impacted near the South Pole, and that place is named as Jawahar Cell. For the simple reason, we did the impacting on the birthday of Jawaharlal Nehru. That's November 14. So we named the place also as per that. So Indian flag is there on the moon. In addition, the findings which has been made by the Chandrayaan, they were path-breaking. In fact, we had only a simple objective of trying to look for various kinds of minerals, their stretch of deposits, and whether it can be exploited and so on. But finally, what we found is really a surprise. For the first time in the history of mankind, we have shown that there is presence of water on the moon. Initially with one of the instrument called a mineralogical mapper, which picked up the signal and confirmed there is water. And later, one of the NASA instrument, which is fully developed by them, a synthetic aperture radar, has looked at the polar region of the moon and confirmed that tons of ice deposits are there on the moon. So both these experiments put together, we have clear proof that there is water. The presence of water is very important. As you know, it is a hard vacuum around the moon, and nothing can survive under that environment. So in case later human beings has to go and establish some colony there, the water becomes a most important element. As you know, it's life-supporting one. In addition, it can be dissociated to get the much-needed oxygen for the human beings, and hydrogen can be used as a fuel. The potential of this is very, very high. In addition, there was another experiment in which we were trying to look for helium-3. Helium-3 is emanated while the sun is burning up, and that really goes as waves in the vacuum, hard vacuum. As it approaches the atmosphere, it is deflected by the magnetosphere, and it doesn't penetrate to the atmosphere. So that way we don't get any helium-3 on the surface of the Earth. Whereas in the moon, it is a hard vacuum. This helium-3 gets deposited there, and it is believed that millions of tons of helium-3 may be available on the moon. The potential of this is it is an ideal fuel for the fusion reaction. And if you get the magnitude is such that if you get 1 ton of helium-3, we can have the electricity produced for the entire country for 1 year. So we have spotted areas where helium-3 is there, but they are not in the gaseous form. They all get absorbed into what is called the titanates, and it is in a very complex formulation. So to extract this helium-3 out of the Titanides, again, how to transport it back to Earth? It is going to be very, very expensive. To send up 1 kilogram, today we spend about $20,000 to $30,000 amount. Whereas if you want to bring it back, it is about $300,000 to $400,000. So with that kind of cost economics, it may not be advantageous now to try this. But later, when we have low-cost access to space becomes a reality, it may be possible to bring back the helium and use it for various applications on the Earth itself. So these are some of the potential findings from the helium, from the moon mission, the Chandrayaan. And now we are planning for another mission where a rover will be put on the surface of the moon. It will pick up samples, analyze and send back the data. And again, some of our scientists are seriously looking at what we can do with the exploration for the Mars. Of course, Mars travel is not that easy. We took about 5 days to reach the moon, whereas this will take almost 1 year to reach the Mars, even at the closest approach. So that's going to be, and also the opportunity for the closest approach comes only once in 3 years or so. The next opportunity is in 2013. If you are able to put together a spacecraft and send it to Mars, perhaps we can have the Mars exploration mission coming out of that. So these are some of the exciting findings out of the space exploration. And India has really emerged as a spacefaring nation. Of course, one area where we can cite regrets is with respect to the banned initiatives. Because of the lack of resources, we are not really embarked on that. But still, we have to keep our aims high, so that maybe in the 2020s or so, we should be able to have our manned mission to at least to around Earth, and then later to travel to the moon and so on. So the space is really exciting and challenging field, and these technologies are put to use for the development of the country. But as youngsters, I don't say that everybody has got an opportunity to get into an exotic area like space research or so. But at the same time, the challenges what the country is facing are very high. It should be your ambition to see that the knowledge what you acquire while you are studying here, how it can be put to use for the development of the country. Of course, the statistic clearly shows that in a few years from now, India will emerge as the country with the largest youth population below the age of 30. How to put to use this great potential for the national development should be our motto. First of all, to provide an appropriate education. Education not only which brings out the best in the students, their knowledge level, but their ability to take on a job while they leave the institutions. Employability of the students which are coming out of the college is a concern today. I know that quite often the competitive exams are being conducted by the IT companies, government institutions, research laboratories, etc. The score is very poor. Very small fraction of the students only really qualify for this. That's something which needs to be addressed too. So that means it clearly reflects that there is a shortage of good teachers, which is very much needed for improve the quality of the education. So some of you should be bold enough to enter into the teaching profession. How the knowledge what you are acquiring here can be imparted to the next generation and the next and so on. But for that again, you should have the willingness to explore. While you get into such profession, your research content should improve. You should be able to focus on advanced research so that not only you improve knowledge, but also sometimes you may strike gold with a bright idea among the researchers, and then how that can be converted to a product or service which is which can benefit the society and which can benefit the community outside. As far as India is concerned, today the pressing problems are again related to food. The current rate of increase of the population will demand at least doubling the food grains output in about 10 to 15 years from now. So that means new technologies in terms of either biotechnology or newer words of the breeds of seeds and so on, by which how you can improve the productivity of the soil. Second, of course, the healthcare. Again, it is prohibitively expensive. The devices for monitoring the various parameters of the human body, the drugs which are required for it, drug delivery system which is required, using nanotechnology, etc. becomes an important element. Above all, the energy sector. Today, I think we cannot depend on the fossil fuels. We have to have the alternate source of energy. A lot of research need to be done in harnessing the solar power, the wind power, the bio waste, and so on. Then comes about the water security, how to preserve water, how to really have the water which is underground, how to purify and make it potable, and so on. So if you look around the country itself, a large number of technical problems are in front of us, problems are in front of us which technology only can solve. So that is where probably the technical skills what you acquire has to be married with the demands of the society around you. Then you can emerge as a very powerful nation, and the future is with you. I am sure the youngsters, many of you, instead of going through the conventional route, you will break away from that. You will become entrepreneurs, you will become researchers, you will become good teachers, and above all, the people who can serve the society. Yes, the personal needs will have to be met. That always is a priority for any human being. But at least part of your effort should go to improving the quality of life of the people around you. May God bless you. Thank you.